room is frozen. Not a whisper, not a shuffle, just the heavy silence of the highest court in America moments before everything changed. And then it happened. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward with a smirk that nobody saw coming. A quiet chuckle slipped out, the kind of laugh that isn't about humor but confidence. Power. A lifetime on the bench pressing down on a newcomer daring to challenge him. Across the room stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman in Congress facing one of the most influential figures in American law. Most people would have buckled. Most would have hesitated. But instead, she delivered a response so precise, so calmly devastating, that it left one of the court's longest-serving justices stunned, and the entire chamber holding its breath. What led to this rare moment? And how did a freshman lawmaker manage to flip the script in the nation's highest court, using the justice's own history against him? This moment wasn't just dramatic, it exposed deep tensions about power, experience, and who gets to speak with authority in America's legal system. And when you hear what happened next, you'll understand why clips of this exchange spread like wildfire and why legal scholars are still talking about it today. But to understand just how explosive this confrontation was, you need to know the stakes and the history behind it. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand why this moment hit so hard, we need to zoom out. Because this wasn't just a debate, it unfolded in the most powerful legal chamber in the country, with the future of voting rights hanging in the balance. At the center of it all was a case that had stirred tension nationwide. A challenge to new Texas election rules that critics argued would quietly make voting harder for certain communities. Supporters called the rules neutral and necessary. Opponents warned they echoed a darker history where the barriers weren't always obvious, but the impact was unmistakable. Standing before the justices was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, new to Washington, but not new to fighting voting battles. Before ever stepping onto Capitol Hill, she'd spent years on the legal front lines in Texas, pushing back against policies that chipped away at ballot access. To some, she was a rising star. To others, she was just too new to be taken seriously on a national stage. Across from her sat Justice Clarence Thomas, a man with decades of Supreme Court authority behind him. A justice known for holding firm to narrow interpretations of federal power, and for rarely speaking during arguments, choosing instead to let the law and his opinions speak for him. So here it was, a rookie congresswoman with deep grassroots experience facing off against a veteran justice who had shaped constitutional debates for more than 30 years. Experience versus perspective, tradition versus challenge. A courtroom steeped in formality about to witness something nobody expected. And with the stakes involving the right that defines democracy itself, the power to vote, every word, every tone, every breath carried weight. What happened next didn't just break the tension. It shattered expectations. Inside the Supreme Court, emotions rarely surface. Every word is weighed, every breath measured. It's a place where even subtle reactions become headlines. That's why when it happened, the room changed instantly. Representative Jasmine Crockett had been laying out her argument steady, detailed, and rooted in both history and lived experience. Each point built on the last, connecting past patterns of voter suppression to present-day policies. It wasn't flashy. It was precise. And the room was listening. Then Justice Clarence Thomas, who often sits in silence for long stretches, shifted forward. A quiet chuckle rolled out across the chamber, catching more than a few people off guard. It wasn't casual. It wasn't friendly. It felt like a signal. And when he spoke, the temperature in the room dropped another degree. With a tone that blended amusement and authority, he questioned not her argument but her right to even make it. A reminder of decades on the bench, a pointed reference to her short time in Washington. A veteran jurist essentially suggesting that experience, not evidence, determines who gets to speak with confidence in America's most powerful courtroom. Political watchers have seen sharp exchanges before, but in this setting, in this institution, the remark hit differently. Even seasoned court observers later described it as a rare break in the Supreme Court's polished demeanor. A moment when tradition cracked and the tension beneath the surface finally showed itself. For a split second, you could almost feel the question hanging in the room. Would this freshman lawmaker falter under the weight of seniority? But if anyone thought the comment would shake her, they were about to witness something very different. Because what came next wasn't a retreat, it was a pivot that would flip the entire dynamic of the room. For a heartbeat, The room sat in stillness, that kind of silence where every eye shifts to the person who just got challenged, waiting to see whether they crumble or rise. Somewhere in that quiet, Jasmine Crockett exhaled, and instead of shrinking back, she leaned forward. Her voice stayed calm, steady, almost too steady for a moment like this. She didn't match the chuckle. She didn't flinch. What she did instead was far sharper. She acknowledged the decades of experience Thomas held not as surrender, but as setup. Then she pivoted. She reminded the room that experience isn't measured only in titles or time served in marble halls, but in lived reality. In the years spent challenging voter restrictions on the ground, long before cameras were watching. "You may have history on your side," she said without raising her voice. "But I have the people who lived it on mine." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The quiet conviction hit harder than any dramatic outburst ever could. Observers later said you could feel something shift in that moment. The dynamic flipped from a senior figure asserting authority to a rising voice proving presence. Even those who disagreed with her politically felt it, that rare spark where confidence meets preparation, and a newcomer refuses to let legacy become a cage. And the room realized this wasn't intimidation. This was ignition, because from that moment forward, Crockett wasn't playing defense. She was just getting started, and the next point she raised, it caught everyone, even her critics, fully off guard. What made Crockett's next move so striking wasn't just what she argued, it was how she reframed the entire debate. Because instead of trading barbs or leaning on emotion, she walked straight into the legal core of the issue and pulled the foundation into the light. She reminded the chamber that voting rights battles aren't relics of dusty history books, they're alive, shifting and adapting. Modern restrictions rarely announce themselves with blatant language. Instead, they show up dressed in neutral procedure, security updates, and administrative adjustments. Rules that look clean on paper, yet land hardest on communities already fighting to be heard. And then she went further, connecting the dots between past and present with precision. She cited prior cases where subtle tweaks to ballot access were later exposed as strategic moves. Not dramatic bans, but quiet filters designed to reshape who gets a voice in democracy. It wasn't about accusing anyone in the room. She chose her words with the kind of care that says, "I know the rules here, and I play them better than you expect." But the implication was unmistakable. When systems evolve, protections must evolve too. And pretending modern tactics don't exist just because they don't mirror the past is not neutrality, it's neglect. Crockett didn't claim certainty. She didn't swing wild accusations. She simply asked the essential question that shook the conversation. If history shows us methods change, why would those who benefit from silence expect us to stop listening for it? The room didn't move. And for once, the weight of legal theory wasn't abstract, it was emotional, human, unavoidable. Because she'd taken a procedural argument and turned it into something bigger. Who gets to define fairness? Who decides when a struggle is over? And who gets left waiting outside the system while that debate happens? It didn't matter where anyone stood politically. That moment forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth that laws aren't always about what they say, but who they shape. And just when it felt like the room might exhale, Crockett added one more layer, one nobody expected from a newcomer standing before such towering authority. Because the next question wasn't legal, it was personal. And it hit harder than any statute ever could. The moment she finished speaking, the air didn't just feel heavy, it felt charged. Not loud, not chaotic, just tense in that way where everyone knows something significant just happened, but no one wants to be the first to react. For a breath, the chamber held still. Observers leaned forward just slightly. Pens paused above notepads. Even those who entered the room convinced they already knew the correct side of the argument suddenly found themselves paying closer attention than they planned to. Justice Thomas didn't immediately respond, and that silence spoke louder than any rebuttal. In institutions built on hierarchy, hesitation, even brief, can feel seismic. Others on the bench shifted, brows tightened, eyes flicked between the two. Not because they agreed or disagreed, but because the dynamic had changed. Gone was the assumption that seniority alone would guide the conversation. Gone was the notion that a newcomer was there to simply absorb criticism and tread softly in the presence of legacy. Instead, they were watching someone who understood the room, respected its weight, and still refused to shrink beneath it. And outside those walls, word traveled fast. It always does. Clips spread through political circles. Commentators scrambled to frame what had just happened, and social feeds lit up with reactions ranging from stunned admiration to disbelief. Supporters praised the composure, calling it proof that new voices are shaping the nation's political future, not waiting for permission. Critics, well, they questioned tone, timing, and whether tradition should ever be challenged so directly. Some even suggested she'd gone too far, while others argued she hadn't gone far enough. But inside the courtroom itself, something else lingered, a quiet acknowledgement, even from those who'd never admitted publicly. This wasn't a moment of disrespect. It was a moment of arrival, and as the chamber slowly shifted back into motion, one thing became crystal clear. This exchange wasn't an ending. It was the opening of a much larger conversation. Because if a single challenge could disrupt decades of unspoken norms, what would happen when the broader fight moved from one room to the entire nation? What happened in that room didn't just stay inside four marble walls, it tapped into something much bigger, simmering across the country. Because beneath the legal language and polished decorum was a truth people have been feeling for years. A new generation isn't waiting to be invited into power. It's stepping in, speaking up, and refusing to let tradition decide who gets a voice. For decades, politics has been shaped by seniority, by long resumes, long tenures, and long-established rules about who belongs where. But moments like this disrupt that blueprint. They show that knowledge doesn't only come from decades on a bench or years in institutions. Sometimes it comes from being close enough to the real world to feel the changes and the pressure as they happen. And that's where Crockett's presence became symbolic. Not because she claimed to know more than anyone else, but because she represented a shift millions recognize. The rise of leaders shaped by lived experience, not legacy. People saw echoes of a wider cultural divide, one between voices guarding tradition and voices pushing toward a future where power isn't reserved, it's earned in real time. The hearing wasn't a clash between individuals. It was a quiet confrontation between eras, between old assumptions and new realities. And in an age where social media has turned politics into a front-row spectacle, these moments travel faster than ever. Younger voters clipped the exchange, shared it, celebrated the boldness. Older audiences debated the decorum and dignity of challenging established authority head-on. Analysts dissected every sentence, trying to understand if this was a one-off spark or the start of a pattern. But the true impact wasn't in the commentary, it was in the message. You don't need decades behind you to change the tone of the room. You just need the courage to stand in it differently. And that's what shook people, not just the words, but what they represented. A reminder that political power in America is not fixed. It shifts, it adapts, and every so often it gets redefined right in front of us. This wasn't about disrespecting the past. It was about proving the future is already here. And it speaks with a voice that won't wait its turn. And as the debate left that chamber and echoed across the country, one question lingered louder than the rest. If a single exchange can change the temperature of the room, what happens when these voices become the room? In the end, what unfolded wasn't just a clash of views, it was a collision of eras. A reminder that power in America isn't inherited by time served, or sealed by tradition, or granted by stone columns and centuries-old rules. Sometimes it's claimed in a single moment when someone refuses to let history speak louder than their own voice. This wasn't about winning a point. It wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. It was about presence, about stepping into a room built by generations before you, and making it clear that your generation isn't here to whisper, wait, or wonder if it's allowed to lead. And whether people agreed with her or not, one thing became impossible to deny. The landscape is shifting. Voices once treated as new are becoming necessary. Conversations once reserved for the powerful are being reshaped by those who lived the impact, not just studied it. Moments like this don't fade, they ripple. They raise questions, challenge comfort, and force everyone watching to think about who gets to shape the future and who gets told to wait their turn. Because the truth is, no matter where you stand politically, no matter which side of the argument you favor, there's a new reality settling in. Power isn't just aging, it's evolving, and it sounds different now. So the real question isn't about the debate that day, it's about what comes after. When voices like this grow louder, when more leaders step forward instead of bowing back, when experience stops being a gate and becomes a guide, what will American power look like then? And maybe the bigger question, the one everyone is quietly asking now, is this: If one exchange can shake expectations in a room that rarely bends, what happens when millions of voices start pushing at once?